Our next speaker is Caird Rexroad. He's going to talk about USDA ARS aquaculture research and assessment of aquatic genetic resources.
All right. Thank you, Gary. I very much appreciate the opportunity to come here and tell you a little bit about what we have going on in USDA ARS. As Gary said, my name is Caird Rexroad. I'm the National Program Leader for Aquaculture. And so what I have for you this afternoon is really two topics that I will try to fit into my time allotment. The first is to give you an update on our research programs. If you're not familiar with them, this might be new information. I think some of you are pretty familiar with those. But then also to talk about another activity that we've been involved with recently through the Interagency Working Group on Aquaculture and assessing our nation's aquatic genetic resources. So when we look at the role that we can play as scientists in aquaculture, we look at some of the challenges that are facing this industry. We have a need for new aquatic animal health management tools in terms of vaccines, genetic improvement, and other strategies. We always have new species that are coming online that need these tools. We have to define the nutrient requirements for all of these species that we're raising. And so there's a lot of work to be done there. I think for our agency, we spend most of our time in this fourth bullet, improving genetics, management practices, and production systems that enhance production efficiency, product quality, healthfulness, animal welfare, and improving our impact on the environment. And so that is what our program in ARS is built to address. I thought I should have a slide on where we get our priorities. And so on the left-hand side, you can see we get our priorities from presidential initiatives. We haven't seen what will drive the initiatives of the next administration, but of the previous administration, certainly climate change was one of the major drivers for our programs. We get specific guidance from Congress on the kinds of research activities that we need to have, but also from stakeholders and from meetings like this, from meeting with folks, including extension folks and producers and other groups that represent these industries to decide where we're best able to spend our resources and make an impact in the industry. And so on the right-hand side here, I have our role to work with stakeholders to identify constraints to improving production. And in fact, we rely heavily on extension folks for help to identify those constraints, improving production, product efficiency, product quality, and all the things that I mentioned on the previous slide. It's then our responsibility to develop science-based approaches that complement industry efforts and capacity for problem solving. So the industry already has some of that capacity. It's our role, and Kola, you were on your slide talking about what's inherently federal, and we have the same perspective. What is it that is the best use of our resources and expertise? And then after that, we think that we have a farm-to-fork responsibility in aquaculture to conduct research and technology transfer. So just a little bit about our program. We're 18 projects that are congressionally appropriated. There's 47 scientists that are spread around the nations, and in the darker color here I have some of the states where we have some of our labs located. We have critical partnerships with about 40 funded collaborators, and those are university folks or from NGOs, people that have expertise that add capacity to our program. 10 laboratory sites, a budget of $28 million, $8 million of which is proposed to be cut in the President's FY18 budget. And we focus our work both on freshwater and marine systems. And so our program components are really species specific. We don't do all of this work in every species, but every stakeholder that we talk to, genetic improvement, the need for improved genetic stocks is a priority. And so we have a good bit of our program that is aimed at breeding and the use or the development of genomic tools to improve breeding strategies that are in use by the industry. We had a picture of Rick Barrows in the previous talk defining the nutrient requirements and identifying alternative sources of proteins and lipids for fish feeds. The health of aquatic animals is extremely important for every species. Sustainable production systems, and we do a good bit of work in recirculating aquaculture. And then finally, product quality and new products, for instance, working on off-flavor issues with species like catfish. So I've listed some of the species that we work with on the far side there: catfish and their hybrids, striped bass and their hybrids, trout, salmon, Pacific oysters, tilapia, and also the eastern oyster. And so that's the majority of our portfolio. So the approach that we take is that any kind of production system is going to include these different factors, what we call the G by E by M by P. So G is for the genetics, where we're talking about the domestication status of a species. In evolutionary terms, all of the species that we work with in aquaculture are relatively recently domesticated. For some species, we have selective breeding programs, chromosome set manipulations, such as using triploids and for some species we have monosex populations. We look at the environment, the production system. Are we in ponds, raceways, RAS, net pens? Management practices, including biosecurity, how are we managing aquatic animal health, stocking densities, nutrition, things like that. And then the post-harvest factors. How do we affect the post-harvest quality by our pre-harvest management practices? And then in the bottom here, I've included the societal factors, and this is something that ARS doesn't do, but we certainly realize the importance of the consumer values, the economics, and the marketing that goes into the success of the aquaculture enterprise. And so with that, I just wanted to point out some of the 2016 accomplishments that we had. If you were able to read Dave Love's recent publication that highlighted the return on investment for federal aquaculture research, he looked at $1 billion spent over the last 10 years, and the return on investment was 37 to 1. And so I think this is demonstrating that it's a good investment in his publication. He actually points to the ARS annual report as a measure of accountability for the federal funds that are spent towards the industry. And so here, I don't expect folks to read these lines, but every one of these lines is associated with one or more publications or technology transfer, something that went towards solving a problem that one of our stakeholders is having in production. And so if you just look at the volume by number of lines, you can see on the left we've got salmonids and primarily rainbow trout and Atlantic salmon, on the right catfish, but then we also do some work in oyster, shrimp, hyperstriped bass, and tilapia. So all of these annual reports are available on our website if you'd like to see them. So then I'll shift to the second part of my talk. So the state of the world's aquatic genetic resources for food and agriculture. So I was approached by folks at the Department of State who are involved with, of course, the UN and the FAO. And there's a commission on genetic resources for food and agriculture that had an interest in characterizing the aquatic genetic resources on the planet. And so they decided the approach that they would take is to go to every country and ask for a country report that highlighted what the resources that we had, and then we could combine these into the State of the World Aquaculture Report and compare resources. And one thing that this might be able to identify for us is species that are cultured in one country but not in another, where that species might also be native. And so there's some opportunities that might present themselves. And so they came to us, I think, in ARS, having an interest in genetics and doing genetics type work, and also having an aquaculture program. So we were asked to kind of lead this effort. So I went to Gene and I said, this really seems like something that should be done through the Interagency Working Group on Aquaculture. And he agreed. And so we approached the different members of the committee to be able to participate in answering the survey. So the answers are based on federal documents and our own professional knowledge of aquaculture. And so it's a small group. We knew that that is a limited resource and that we would have to go to some other folks for some additional expertise. So some of the impetus behind this, coming up for tools for improving the conservation, sustainable use, and development of aquatic genetic resources, identifying threats to our aquatic genetic resources was another topic of interest for this report. And then finally, inform the development of national policies, legislation, research, and development. And that's actually one of the chapters that went into this report. So the country report itself is 50 survey questions that are included in what is now a 100-page document that is inclusive of our responses. I'll go through the breakdown of the 8 chapters. So in chapter 1, the use and exchange of aquatic genetic resources is where we kind of laid out what are the species that are most often propagated here in the U.S. Are they selectively bred? Are they triploids? Are they monosex populations? We answered questions like that. Chapter 2, what are the drivers and trends in aquaculture? What are the consequences for aquatic genetic resources within our national jurisdiction? So here we just used our best judgment, and we were optimistic about aquaculture, and we said that it was up and coming and that the outlook was very positive. Chapters 3 and 4 are related about the conservation of aquatic genetic resources. The in situ chapter is mostly concerning Fish and Wildlife Service activities, where we propagate species for conservation efforts, supporting recreational fisheries in a place where they're native. Chapter 4, then, the ex situ conservation, is more about how we're doing germplasm preservation. This might include cryopreservations and things like that. And of course, in USDA, we have the National Animal Germplasm Preservation Program in Colorado Springs, where we archive a lot of the selective breeding germplasm that we have. And so that's where we got our answers. Chapter 5, identifying the stakeholders who are interested in aquaculture. And so this was everything from the different associations that we have, the people who are included, the tribal communities, the fisheries folks, and folks who are interested in natural resource conservation. Chapter 6, laying out the national policies and legislation, and we found a lot of them. This wasn't just the Aquaculture Act of 1980. We included different levels of policies that different agencies have, such as FDA regulations on transgenics and things like that. 7 was a chapter that Gene took on for us, research, education, training our workforce, some of our extension activities. And then finally, Chapter 8, international collaboration on aquatic genetic resources for farm species. And so here's where we tried to lay out some of the bilateral agreements that we have. We have agreements that are inclusive of aquaculture genetic research with Israel. We have them with Japan, and there's other good examples in there that we laid out. So the folks that were on the committee were myself and Gene, Kristen Gruenthal represented NOAA. We wanted to make sure to have some industry representation on there, so Paul Sajak from NAA was willing to join us. Nathan Wilkie from Fish and Wildlife Service, Harvey Blackburn is with us in ARS. FDA was represented by Eric Silberhorn and Eric Landis, and then Charles Brinkman joined us from Department of State. And so the approach we had was that members would attempt to answer an individual chapter to the best of their ability. We would take that, we would review it as a committee and kind of come up with consensus answers, because we're looking for answers that best represent our nation and our federal government. We had some gaps, and so we requested some specific information from colleagues outside of our committee, and we completed the draft. So on or about May 1, we decided that we needed to send this out for comment. All of you in this room, I hope you've seen it. Otherwise, we missed you on a listserv somewhere, but we sent it out through Aqua Contacts. Gene sent it out to the membership of the IWGA. Paul sent it out through all the associations, through the NAA. NRSP8 is a genomics group through USDA that works in different species, so we were inclusive of them. And then we sent it out to just the employees in our agencies of ARS, NEFA, and NOAA. So the idea here was that we would get final review and agency clearance. So this is a technical document. Department of State doesn't need to clear it, but just in terms of the folks that represented our committee, we wanted to make sure their agencies were okay with its submission to the FAO. And we're planning submission here by the end of June. And so there's still an opportunity to comment on it. We haven't submitted, but it includes many of the species that are propagated here in the U.S. And so whatever you're working on, if it's not in there, it should be. And that's kind of what we're asking, is for folks to contribute where we may have missed. Some of the supporting documentation that we use, the 4th annual report on aquaculture and policy in the United States of America was something prepared for a UJNR meeting. We also used the Fisheries of the United States report from NOAA, the 2013 Census of Aquaculture. We also pulled in information from the dietary guidelines. The National Aquaculture Association has large volumes of literature on everything that is cultured in the U.S., and then also a white paper on aquaculture genomics, genetics, and breeding in the United States that came out of a workshop hosted by John Liu in Auburn in 2015. And so these were kind of the technical documents that were supporting the information we put in here. So a status, we think we're ready to submit. We have a 100-page draft. You know, I sent it out on all these listservs, and I got 3 comments back. And one of them was spelling errors that were in the questions and not in the answers, but that happens. It describes U.S. freshwater and marine genetic resources that are related to food production, and so we really weren't able to be inclusive of things like ornamentals and things, but at least as far as food production, we feel like we have it covered. We answered the majority of the questions. We did not answer all of the questions. There is some data that the federal government just doesn't keep, and so there was some information on the trade exchange of domestic species farmed in other countries and not in the U.S. that we just didn't have that. Information on exchanging live genetic resources. It's just not something, I couldn't find an agency that tracks that, and so we're just not going to be able to answer that. We laid out some what we thought were aquaculture trends and information on species-specific broodstock technologies. And so what we laid out, and most of this information coming from the Fisheries of the United States and the UJNR report and the census, the USDA census, you know, what are the species that are advanced, what are the species that for which we keep economic data, and then what are the species that quite haven't met that threshold for economic data in the U.S., so they're up and coming. So with that, I think Gary's standing up, so I think we'll end it there. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you.